Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at a covenantal approach to our study of Old Testament theology. We begin with the covenantal history, going all the way back to creation, and I want to suggest that the Bible has this idea of a creation covenant where God gives a land. Now, as you say a land, He gives all the land, He gives the earth, but more particularly, remember when Adam and Eve were created, they're placed into a garden, a very specific land. And you say, wait a minute, I don't remember the word covenant being used to describe that in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. But when I get to Hosea chapter 6, verse 7, looking back at the Adam and Eve story, the prophet can say, but like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. There they have dealt treacherously against me. So there's a sense in which this idea of a covenant perhaps goes all the way back to Adam, in which there is a warning of a curse that's placed upon him if he transgresses the command of God, the covenant command, and it's a covenant of life and of death, because if he transgresses, remember he's told in Genesis chapter 2, in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And we know the story. You remember that sure enough they do die, and they are thrown out of the garden. And yet when that happens, they don't die immediately. Eventually death takes place. But you say, why didn't death take place immediately? And that's because there is death. It's when you read about God giving to them coats of skin. And so there's a salvation promise, and we understand that, that there is the first sacrifice that is made there in the garden, as the specter of death will be upon them eventually. Now, from dust you were made, from dust you shall return, and they are going to eventually die. Now, when we come to the Noah story, now we have the word covenant used, where God says to Noah, Genesis chapter 6, I'm going to make a covenant with you and with your family. And eventually we read about a covenant with all the earth, in which there is a renewal of the land. There is destruction, there's the flood, and yet God again gives a land. This time he tells the same thing that he had said back at the creation covenant: go and fill the earth, and it will be your earth. He says, from now on, I'm not going to send a flood every time you sin. Instead, you are going to judge sin. Whoever kills someone, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood will be shed. The next time I read about a covenant idea is with Abraham, where God comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to make a covenant with you, Abraham, and I'm going to give you a land. And actually sends him to the land of Canaan. But at the time, he doesn't get all of the land. In fact, you get to the end of the Abraham story, and the only land that he has is the little parcel of land in which he's going to be buried. But the promise remains the promise of a land. And that is passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to the sons of Jacob. And the sons of Jacob end up leaving the land. They end up going to Egypt. And now God brings them out of Egypt, and he brings them to Mount Sinai, where again he enters into a covenant with them, and there are blessings and cursings that are given to them. They're spelled out in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Leviticus chapter 26 talks about if you are faithful to me, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to plant you in the land. It's going to be wonderful. But if you do not obey me, I'll bring all these hardships, and the culmination of all of that is that you'll be driven from the land. When we get to the kingship, we have, of course, King Saul first, but then there is King David, and God enters into a covenant with David. And to David, he says, he puts David and his descendants as the king over the land. Obey me, and you'll be in the land. Disobey me, I'll drive you from the land. That had been part of the Mosaic Covenant. So this isn't something totally distinct and separate. It's still God's people. And sure enough, they are removed from the land. First, the northern kingdom of Israel, where 10 tribes are taken from Solomon, and for a time they are there, but then they are removed from the land because of their sin. And finally, the southern kingdom, they are also removed from the land. And yet God brings them back to the land. In the days of Zerubbabel, that's told in the book of Ezra, they come back and are replanted in the land. The temple which had been destroyed is now rebuilt. And there's a promise that God is going to do something again with his people. He is going to make a new covenant. But we find out when we get to the New Testament, the new covenant is the story of the king who dies for his kingdom, so that God's Spirit can be placed within them and his law can be written not on tablets of stone, but upon men's hearts. Now, here's a different chart. This one was given to me by my senior pastor, T.J. Campo. We begin with creation and looking at the same thing, where we have the promise of a people through first Adam and Eve, but ultimately through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the people of Israel. We're going to be the people of God. He brings them to Sinai. He says, you will be my covenant people. I will plant you in the land. We've already noted that theme of the land all throughout these covenants. I will make a nation of you, and I'm going to give you a king. So those aspects that we just looked at, a people, a land, a nation, and a king, were all part of those covenant people. But if you wanted to meet God, if you wanted to get to know God, you had to come to a place. You had to come to the place where the tabernacle was, and for a time that was at Mount Sinai, and then that comes into the land, and finally the temple is built, and that place will become Jerusalem. And if you wanted to get to know God, you had to come to this place. Wherever you were in the world, you had to come to this place to get to know God. It's not that God wasn't everywhere, but his special manifested place was in this place of Israel with its capital at Jerusalem. But then when Jesus comes, that changes, and he sends his disciples. That begins in Jerusalem, and he says, "You will be witnesses of me, both here in Jerusalem, but then in Judea and in Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth." And he sends his disciples out to go and make disciples of the nations. So that instead of being a select people, there will now be all people who will be God's people, make disciples of all the nations, the whole world. It is going to be, in fact, we read that Numbers promises, Numbers chapter 14, verse 21, where God said, "Indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." And he sends his disciples to make disciples of all the nations, because Jesus now is the King. And so we have this promise of Jesus where he says, "If I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself." And now we find out that instead of a temple, that he is the temple. He says, "Destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it up." He's talking about the temple of his body. And people ask me all the time, is God, going to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem? Actually, he's going to rebuild the temple everywhere, because he says not only is Jesus the temple, but you are the temple that he is building right now. That you are the temple. And not only are you the temple, in the Old Testament, you have this image of Jesus, of Israel as the vine, but Jesus is the vine, and he says, are you connected to me to have continuing life? And he is the servant of the Lord that was prophesied in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, Israel was God's servant, but now Jesus is the better servant who obeyed his Father's will. And whereas the Old Testament promised a seed, Paul in Galatians chapter 3 points out that Jesus is the seed, and that it wasn't just talking about seeds plural, it was talking about the seed, and that is Jesus. Are you connected to him?